I'm Jim Check. You're watching Now Media. With me, Eleanor Sturko, MLA for Surrey, Cloverdale, also the critic for public safety and the Solicitor General. That's a big post for sure, especially with what's going on here in British Columbia and across Canada. Crime, addiction, homelessness, top concerns all over the province and, of course, all over Canada as well. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
I did a bunch of interviews. I interviewed the president of BIABC, and then he had some grim stats to share for sure. 67% of business surveys said street disorder has increased in the past year. 74% of businesses said that their staff have anxiety and fear. And then the really tough one is that 19% of the businesses may not be financially viably into the next year. And that is all to do with like some of the violence that's going on, the theft, the broken glass, all those different things are all just piling up for small businesses.
Yeah, it's really concerning. Actually, last week I had the opportunity to head over to Prince George, Quesnel, Williams Lake. I was actually in Kelowna for the Western Canadian Championships for triathlon and swim bike and visited the city. So I had a chance to see firsthand in communities outside the Lower Mainland some of the challenges that those communities are dealing with. And it's really, really tough. It's challenging. I think one of the biggest impacts that's really happened to businesses across BC is the fact that decriminalization of drugs really has removed accountability from behaviors that are antisocial, that can often be associated with some of the behaviors that cause fear. With some of the violence that we see on the street. We know that a police officer in Kelowna was actually assaulted by someone with some very serious issues, lost an eye. So these are really serious problems that we're dealing with. But the good news is that there's actually solutions that can be implemented here provincially. This isn't all about federal bail reform. And there's things that can be done that will substantially improve the conditions for business owners.
Yeah, the mayor sent out a letter. The mayor, Tom Dias, here in Kelowna, sent a letter to Sean Fraser as well. You spoke about bail reform, but he had he highlighted one file, and as a former police officer, he was with the RCMP for a number of years, I take it. How many years with the RCMP?
Just under 14.
Yeah, so 14 years. You understand what's going on. This one person has a file like 200 and I'm just going to see if I can find this actual. And can we put up the thing? Rommel, 223 files between 2021 and 25, 32 failures to comply, and 32 failures to appear. Like, how do you get out the next time when you have 32 failures to appear? That's what I'm wondering. What is the magic number on failures to appear? Is it 50? Is it 100? Like, when does the judge say, I'm not letting you out, you never come back?
Yeah, I mean, certainly those kind of things point to a need for bail reform, a need for sentencing reform. But at the end of the day, too, and I know this firsthand from when I was policing, many individuals who have these types of records also have underlying mental health issues. They have underlying addictions issues. And until proper supports are put in place to actually support people when they're either out on bail or when they're living amongst us in the community again, nothing will change. And that's why you see such intense repetition. I can't speak to the individual that you're speaking of with, over 200 files and 200 releases and breaches. But, one of the things that's really damaged, I guess, our justice system as a whole in Canada, we felt it acutely here in British Columbia, is when bail reform came in and changed, to bring in really an expanded principle of restraint, which told judges that they need to release people at the earliest possible opportunity with the least restrictive bail conditions. And so really people weren't being held accountable for breaking the rules that the courts themselves had put in to help keep people on track. Without that accountability, we see an emboldening of people's behavior, which has led us to where we are with the amount of street disorder we see in places like Kelowna today.
You seem to have frozen there, but your voice is still there, which is great.
I know, I see myself frozen too, so I apologize for being frozen. I kind of look a bit angry in the photo. I can assure you I'm not angry. I'm enjoying the conversation. Sorry.
We'll see if it comes back on its own, and we may ask you to log out and come back in. We'll just see where it goes here for a couple seconds. You say there's some solutions out there outside of bail reform. What are they, and where's their hope for small businesses in British Columbia here?
Well, first and foremost, I've been calling on David Eby and the NDP to end decriminalization in British Columbia. So in 2024, the Premier said that he would be rolling back decriminalization in public and just allowing for decriminalization to exist within people's homes. However, we know that they continue to, tell police that they will not entertain charges of drug possession. And, that really does have a consequence. If there is no reason for an individual, no incentive for them to stop their rampant public drug use, public intoxication, these people will not do that. There's no incentive for them to stop that behavior. Many of these behaviors are leading to the street disorder that business owners are dealing with. So first and foremost, the Premier needs to end the decriminalization pilot, both the official decrim pilot and, then the de facto decriminalization that exists because they don't press charges for people doing drugs in public. Second of all, we need to have appropriate housing for individuals. It's not enough to be putting them into these SROs and warehousing people in what they call supportive housing, but really don't actually have the kinds of services that people with severe addictions, mental illness, brain injury that they actually need. So, even when I was up north last week, we heard an example from a housing provider that they had an individual who was hard to house, had assaulted healthcare workers, and had essentially destroyed the publicly funded housing they were put in within 3 days. That's obviously a symptom that that's not the right housing for that person. So we need the right fit of housing. That's something that is within the provincial purview to provide, including intensive housing, or if you want to say forms of institutional care to support involuntary care for those that need it. And then we also need a scaling up of mental health services within the Mental Health Act and outside the Mental Health Act. We have a number of people. We saw significant tragedies, especially in the Lower Mainland with Lapu Lapu, individuals, with a history of severe mental illness getting into trouble that, has actually killed other British Columbians. And so we need a scaling up of those really, really essential social services that help people who have severe mental health addictions and brain injury. And we need to do that sometimes even on an expanded involuntary basis.
Why do you think the NDP are dragging their feet on this? Because that decriminalization is supposed to kind of come to an end as well, that, like that pilot project. Why aren't they just acting more swiftly? I mean, it seems like the evidence is piling up to what you're saying, that this is the better path forward.
Well, it's ideological, and this is also something that was fundamental to a lot of the support that they had, going into their last election to try some of these experiments that ended up being absolute disasters. Their safe supply experiment ended up seeing taxpayer-funded drugs dumped into the hands of organized criminals and actually fueling the fentanyl trade and not helping people get better, sadly. And of course, decriminalization has led to just a tremendous increase in street disorder. South of the border in Oregon, they actually did a review of how their decriminalization pilot affected their crime rates, and they found that their violent crime vastly increased as a result of their decriminalization pilot. I know that we've seen the same thing here. The government refuses to put out statistics on that because really they're trying to hide the mess that they've made. I think that they are slowly turning around, but I mean, it's difficult. I mean, when you're the Premier, do you want to actually admit full force and full-throatedly that the programs that you've overseen have been a disaster? Or do you want to somehow, shift slowly and pretend that this was always your idea all along to increase services for mental health addiction and, housing?
I recently interviewed Terry Young, and he's the minister in charge of community safety, and he said that he's sharing information. He shares all the information. He's a former police officer as well with the Vancouver Police Department, but he says he shares everything with you in the hopes of a better, like a better path forward. Is that accurate?
No. He wants to, I think, portray that we're collaborating. The reality is that, we've been calling for things like transparency on the safe supply scandal. We've been calling for the immediate end of the decriminalization pilot. And no, we aren't collaborating. Parliamentary Secretary Young, I think, would like to make this a nonpartisan issue, primarily because of the NDP's failures. You see that often. You'll go to these events and it'll be talking about crime or street disorder or poverty. And someone from the government will say, you know what, dealing with poverty is a nonpartisan issue. unfortunately, it is a partisan issue because it is the decision making of the government in power that has led us to the situation that we're in. It is their resistance to enforcing the laws on the books, and I'm talking about drug laws that would help us reduce public drug use and hold people accountable and use our courts to compel people towards recovery services. Their decision not to do that has led us to the place that we're in. So these are partisan issues. And from the Conservative Party of British Columbia's point of view, we need to be much more firm in our use of our court system to compel people towards recovery, to be able to help compel people towards healthcare, and to be able to have that accountability for destructive antisocial behavior that's actually affecting the economy. It's closing businesses, it's impacting tourism, and it's making people feel afraid. 1 in 5 businesses, as you said, worried that they won't be able to stay open in the next year if we don't improve things. So, as much as Parliamentary Secretary Young wants to talk about collaboration, if it was true collaboration, we would see them acting a lot more swiftly and adopting a lot more of these common sense solutions we're proposing.
I did press him on it because I did say that in the health ministry, it's almost impossible for us to get information. And, when I spoke to some conservative MLAs, they say they can't get it either. And I said, well, is this the same case here in this ministry? And he said, absolutely not. I share the information. We're colleagues and good friends. And I said, well, I mean, that's the only path forward is to find, if you can't have the information, how can you add to the solution? And he assured me that he was sharing it. So.
Well, I think one of the ways in which we often get our information as critics is because people whose businesses are on the brink of ruin, we talk to them. And after we've exposed that, it often gets reported in the media. Then you'll see someone like Parliamentary Secretary Young then going and meeting with those businesses as well. So in that respect, yes, we expose their failures. They go talk to the people. And I guess we're on the same page as far as that. But I think that even a couple of years ago, we couldn't have been further apart in our drug policies. We couldn't have been further apart in this government's absolute denial of the fact that Canada's justice system needs reform, that bail reform was an absolute necessity. If people remember back, and it was mayors like the mayor of Kelowna who went with UBCM, so the Union of British Columbia Mayors, and at that time it was actually Attorney General David Eby who they talked to about. We had rampant violent attacks in Vancouver. It was 6 people on average being randomly attacked by a stranger every single day. You guys were getting attacks here. I think one of the stories even recently was an attack that happened to paramedics in your community, where people just came into the bay where paramedics are waiting, to serve the public and to actually attack, individuals who are here to do the good of our province. And, these types of attacks are because of a lack of services and a lack of accountability on the street. We need to be holding people accountable. The reluctance of the NDP, even in 2023, to call for bail reform, we could have been so much further ahead. We could have had a much stronger bail system by now. But, every step of the way, the reality is that ideologically, the NDP don't believe in keeping people in custody. They don't. But we're actually the opposite. We do think there are times when it is appropriate to keep individuals off the streets because it protects the public from the behaviors and antisocial behaviors and violent behaviors of people who need to be kept off the streets for rehabilitation and to protect others. Unfortunately, that's not how David Eby has seen things. He's an activist premier that spent the majority of his young life as a lawyer fighting against the police, fighting to keep people out of incarceration even when they needed it. And so, I'm glad to see they're slowly but surely coming around to, a common sense approach. It's only common sense that you keep dangerous people away from others, for the good of society. And I think that we actually need to even push harder, and we need to go further to make sure that we're keeping communities safe.
Terry Young also spoke of BC's new community safety and targeted enforcement program, C-STEP, and he said that they introduced that in the spring with a $5 million budget to address street disorder, but I can't imagine $5 million going very far. Any comments on that?
Yes, and I'm already hearing from police organizations across the province that, even when they make applications, the government's broke. and they're not actually doling out the cash. It's a way for them to save money, making announcements, but not actually following through with delivering so that they can try to scrounge the pennies together to make up for their massive and ever ballooning deficit and debt that we have here in the province. The other, factor is that programs like C-STEP add more prosecutions to the BC Prosecution Service. We already know in Kelowna, in the interior British Columbia, your BC Prosecutors Association, which is the group that represents BC prosecutors who work at the BC Prosecution Service, have filed a grievance with their employer because of not enough Crown prosecutors to actually handle the caseload that they experience in places like Kelowna. So when you add $5 million worth of new prosecutions onto the backs of an already overburdened prosecution service, you're actually going to slow down the courts. You're going to end up having more triaging of court cases, and we're going to see more stayed charges instead of the prosecutions that we need to hold people accountable. So when they do things like add $5 million into programs like C-STEP, which is, we should have more targeted enforcement, you have to likewise make those investments in the court system, or you're not going to be able to achieve the full results that you need throughout the justice system to have that accountability.
So many other things to talk about too, because I know that on your X account you're quite vocal there, talking about healthcare. We put out another release today on healthcare because this is another part of it. Another local rural hospital closed, emergency room. I shouldn't say the hospital, but the emergency rooms, and we're seeing that over and over again. And you talk about that quite a bit too, and not a lot of solutions on the way.
Not a lot of solutions. I'm very disturbed by, this quarterly update financially for the province as well, because the sad reality is that the larger the debt and deficit get, and the higher the interest payments that are going to big banks, that means less money for our hospitals and healthcare workers. And at a time when we actually need to have more frontline investment, we have a government that, of course, is going in and making cuts. So it's really complicated, and my heart goes out to people who are impacted by the closures. It's different for us here in the Lower Mainland, because for us, if our local hospital has a closure, we may be able to, in fact, get to another area hospital. Not the case in places, of course, like Kelowna and other places.
Lillooet, 100 Mile House.
I mean, it's just disgusting. And, frankly, it's inexcusable. And I think, again, we're talking about a government that's 8 years in. They talk about, there's been, the last government did this, the last government does that. But, it's almost a decade. Yeah. Fundamentally, what have you been doing this entire time, except for actually ballooning the bureaucracy that they're now having to cut back on? Yeah. And so, instead of making targeted frontline investments and, doing things that would help to even strengthen, for example, unionized workers, union nurses working within hospitals, they became reliant upon contract nurses, which actually increased the cost of nursing to healthcare and weakens actually infrastructure of having the BC Nurses Union, who is the primary source of nurses for British Columbia. And all nurses are doing a great job, but the fact of the matter is we have nurses quitting their government union jobs, taking contracts worth more, being able to refuse overtime, being able to turn down nursing gigs that, are in places that are violent, places where they don't feel well supported or secure. And, it's costing us more to end up with less and less all the time, including, as you say, closures in emergency rooms.
Yeah. As an RCMP member for a long time, I'm sure you understand, like driving the highway, you're telling people in Lillooet to drive a mountain pass to go to Kamloops or something like that, especially when you're already in a stressful situation, and you're said, well, you can just drive that mountain pass and you should be fine.
Yeah, it's not acceptable. And I think it was in Barrier, perhaps 1 or 2 years ago, there was actually a small child that ended up dying because they couldn't get ambulance service, couldn't get to an emergency room. I think that there was provincially another case of that recently in another, I think in northern BC. So, I mean, we're talking about real consequences of the healthcare mismanagement. It's people's lives. It's not like a library closure, for example. You might be able to go and return your book somewhere else. This is actual healthcare, and emergency rooms are for life and death and very, very severe cases. And the fact that you would have these types of closures really, this isn't universal health care that we have anymore. The NDP talks about being staunch defenders of the universal healthcare system, but it is not universal healthcare if you cannot access it. So we need to be able to fight back, really, to make sure that they're restructuring, that they reorganize, and to allow perhaps even for partnerships with organizations that can actually help bridge the difference, the gaps that we have in communities between, hospitals and the community who's, largely without healthcare when we have closures.
Yeah, we talk about it in BC, like crime, like it's really bothering people. Obviously, the addiction crisis, the homelessness, and then just the economy in general. And then you talk about the budget that's out of control. Do you think the NDP has just run out of ideas?
I think that they've run out of ideas, and fundamentally, they've prioritized things that have actually slowed our economy down. And I think that we need to address climate change, for example. It is an important and pressing issue, and it's one, of course, that we need to be mindful of our next generations, and how the impacts of things like wildfires and floods are affecting the province. But the way in which this province has brought in its Clean BC program and other programs to address climate change have actually harmed our economy. We cannot have it be so aggressive that we end up paralyzing our economy. And for example, 50% of young people want to leave the province. There's lots of social programs that we want to implement. There's lots of environmental programs that would be great to implement, but you can't do that unless you have money to pay for it. The taxpayer is at its limit. We're all at our limit. We cannot pay any more taxes. So the money that we need is provincially to pay for our future has to come from economic development. It has to come from sustaining and supporting small businesses, which is why I'm actually glad that some of this conversation about the street disorder and crime, that we're starting to talk about the economic impact of that. If people are too afraid to come down the street into your business, and you end up closing, the economic impact, the impact on employment, it has a significant impact beyond just, levels of crime. We're talking about jobs being lost and people's livelihoods being destroyed. So, we have to get back to a government that prioritizes and balances. Certainly we don't want to scrap all initiatives to do with helping protect and preserve our beautiful environment here and being good stewards of the land and good neighbors globally, to our other provinces and to, other global neighbors. But at the same time, we have to be able to feed people in our province, house them, make sure that they have enough money to survive here, so that we don't have, again, I think it was 750,000 people, or no, 75,000 rather, sorry about that left British Columbia last year. That's not good for us. It makes our tax base smaller. Especially if these are primarily young people seeking opportunity outside the province, we're losing that innovation, that creativity, that brain drain that we just can't afford to lose, especially given the economic outlook. We need young people and innovators and people with bright ideas who want to start businesses in BC. We need them more than ever.
I'm going to leave you with one last question, because it's about 30 minutes, and try to keep these about 30 minutes. One last question, though. There's talk out there on both parties that there may be some leadership challenges, both in the Conservative Party and in the NDP Party. Do you have any comments on either one of those?
There's been some news recently about leadership issues. We're coming up on a caucus meeting. We've had some information about even our leadership review and concerns with memberships coming forward from our party executive. I'm going to reserve any further comment about that until I have an opportunity to meet with my colleagues. I want to respect the processes that we have in place as colleagues to have discussions before we make comments. So, look forward to any future discussions, but anything's possible. I think that there's a lot going on in our province right now. People just want to see solutions. They want to see a party that's working hard, and I can tell you very sincerely that the Conservative Party of British Columbia, myself and my colleagues, were working as hard as I can to hold the government accountable and to get ready to be the next government.
Well, I do thank you for your time today, and we did put up a better picture there where you weren't looking angry there.
That's actually even better than I look today, so that's good. Thank you for. Sorry that my internet connection
No, that's
wasn't very
fine.
good.
And I'd love to catch up with you again because there's so much I'd like to talk to you about. But again, I do have somebody also waiting to do the next interview. So great, and thank you for taking the time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Talk to you again.
And thank you for watching Now Media.
We don't just report the news, we live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent news.